You want to hear about the great Kepler 438b incident? The one where 3 species of supposedly apex predators got their collective asses handed to them by one slightly caffeinated human with a Swiss Army knife and an attitude problem? Pull up a chair, my friend, because this tale is better than any nature documentary you've ever seen. Mostly because David Attenborough would have wet himself narrating it. See, the thing about interstellar hunting expeditions is that everybody thinks they're hot shit until they meet humanity. The Zephyrians with their razor-sharp talons and night vision that makes owls look legally blind. The Krathen with their pack-hunting instincts and teeth that could open cans, if cans existed in their nightmare fuel dimension. And don't get me started on the Vorthak, who literally evolved from something that makes a honey badger look like a cuddly house pet. These 3 species had been the terror of the known galaxy for centuries. They'd hunt together on death worlds for sport, live streaming their kills to millions of subscribers who apparently had nothing better to do than watch apex predators turn local fauna into abstract art. Think of it as the universe's most violent cooking show, except nobody was learning any recipes unless tenderize with claws counts as culinary technique. Their latest target? Kepler 438b, a jungle world so dense with vegetation that satellites couldn't penetrate the canopy. Perfect hunting ground, they figured. Lots of places to hide, plenty of prey, and enough environmental hazards to make the hunt interesting. They'd done their research, of course. Well, as much research as creatures whose idea of scientific method involves stab first, ask questions later could manage. The planet was supposedly uninhabited by sentient life. Keyword, supposedly. Enter Marcus Chen, xenobiologist extraordinaire and the galaxy's most persistent pain in the ass when it came to conservation efforts. Marcus had been stationed on Kepler 438b for 6 months, studying the local ecosystem and filing reports that his supervisors probably used as expensive toilet paper. He lived in a research station that was less cutting-edge facility and more glorified treehouse with Wi-Fi. Marcus was the kind of guy who'd argue with a vending machine if it gave him the wrong change, and he'd probably win. 5'8", built like a marathon runner who occasionally remembered to eat, with the kind of stubborn streak that made mules look reasonable. His idea of proper field attire was cargo pants held together by spite and optimism, paired with boots that had seen more action than most war veterans. The day the hunters arrived, Marcus was 40 feet up in what the locals called a Titan oak, documenting the mating habits of something that looked like a cross between a monkey and a disco ball. His research notes that day included the phrase, surprisingly athletic for something that glitters, which should tell you everything you need to know about his scientific methodology. He noticed the ship first, a sleek, Predator-class vessel that screamed, "We're here to kill things and look good doing it." It landed in the only clearing large enough to accommodate it, which happened to be about 2 clicks from Marcus's treehouse. The human did what any reasonable scientist would do in this situation. He grabbed his binoculars, climbed higher, and decided to become the world's most uncomfortable voyeur. What he saw next would have made a nature photographer weep with joy and terror in equal measure. 3 Zephyrians emerged first, their iridescent feathers catching the alien sunlight like oil slicks with delusions of grandeur. They moved with the fluid grace of dancers who happened to be designed for murder, their heads swiveling constantly as they scanned for threats or snacks. With Zephyrians, the distinction was academic at best. The Krathen pack followed, 7 of them flowing out of the ship like liquid shadows with anger management issues. They communicated in subsonic growls that made Marcus's bones vibrate uncomfortably, which was probably their way of saying hello or which one of you wants to die first. Hard to tell with carnivores. Finally came the Vorthak Alpha, and Marcus would have laughed if he wasn't too busy not falling out of the tree. The thing was built like a tank that had been crossbred with a nightmare and raised on protein shakes. 8 feet tall, covered in scales that looked bulletproof, with arms that could probably bench press a small aircraft. It surveyed the jungle with the confidence of something that had never met a food chain it couldn't top. Marcus activated his comm unit and tried to contact the orbital station. Static. Either the jungle was interfering with the signal, or someone was jamming communications. Given that these hunters probably didn't want witnesses to their weekend massacre, smart money was on the latter. Well, Marcus muttered to himself, this is either going to be educational or fatal, probably both. The hunters spent the first hour setting up camp with military precision, which would have been impressive if it wasn't so deeply concerning. They deployed sensor nets, established a perimeter, and began scanning the local area for interesting things to kill. Marcus watched them work and realized he was witnessing the opening ceremony of his own potential funeral. The Zephyrian leader, Marcus dubbed him Captain Talon, because xenobiologists are apparently terrible at names, began outlining their hunting strategy in Galactic Standard. Lucky for Marcus, he spoke 17 languages fluently and cursed in 12 more, which came in handy when listening to death threats. The jungle offers optimal hunting conditions, Captain Talon announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he'd never been told no in his life. Dense cover, multiple prey species, and environmental hazards that will test our skills appropriately. One of the Craven, a scarred female who looked like she'd been through a blender and come out angrier, sniffed the air and growled something that the universal translator helpfully rendered as blood-scent mammalian. Recent. Marcus looked down at his arm where he'd scraped it on a branch earlier. The cut was small, barely bleeding, but apparently these things could smell a paper cut from a kilometer away. He made a mental note to invest in better band-aids, if he survived this experience. The Vorthak Alpha, who Marcus had christened Professor Scales for his tendency to lecture while preparing to commit violence, rumbled his approval. Excellent. We have fresh prey already marked. The hunt begins at dawn. Dawn was in approximately 8 hours. Marcus had 8 hours to either escape, hide, or figure out how to survive being hunted by the galaxy's most enthusiastic murder tourists. He chose option 4. Get creative. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, and by interesting I mean Marcus proceeded to demonstrate why humans had conquered half the galaxy despite being squishy, slow, and possessing all the natural weaponry of a particularly ambitious houseplant. Marcus spent the next 6 hours doing what humans do best, preparing for a fight they had no business winning through sheer bloody-minded determination and tactical thinking that bordered on the psychotic. He inventoried his supplies. A field kit containing basic medical supplies, sample containers, and a multi-tool that manufacturers claimed could do everything except file his taxes. He had emergency rations that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret, water purification tablets, and a survival manual that was probably written by someone who'd never actually tried to survive anything more dangerous than a dinner party. Most importantly, he had his research data. 6 months of detailed observations about Kepler 438b's ecosystem, including every predator, prey species, environmental hazard, and ecological relationship he'd documented. Information, as they say, is power, and Marcus was about to demonstrate that knowledge could be more dangerous than claws. The human began his preparations with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd watched too many survival shows and retained just enough information to be dangerous. He started by raiding his research station for anything that could be weaponized, repurposed, or used to make his hunters' lives significantly more complicated. Chemical supplies from the lab became improvised smoke bombs and irritants. Sample containers became noisemakers and distraction devices. His camping gear was repurposed into traps that would make the Viet Cong proud and MacGyver weep with joy. Marcus worked with the focused intensity of a man who knew that creativity was the only thing standing between him and becoming an alien appetizer. But the real genius of Marcus's strategy wasn't in what he built. It was in what he knew. See, those 6 months of field research hadn't just been academic masturbation. Marcus had mapped every inch of the surrounding jungle, cataloged every species, and documented behaviors that the hunters couldn't possibly know about. He knew which plants were toxic, which areas flooded during the afternoon rains, and which seemingly innocent creatures would turn violently territorial if disturbed. Most importantly, he knew about the Caleth. The Caleth were Kepler 438b's apex predator, and they made the visiting hunters look like house cats with delusions of adequacy. 12 feet long, built like crocodiles designed by committee with input from nightmares, they were ambush predators that could remain motionless for days waiting for prey. They hunted by vibration, had hide tough enough to stop small arms fire, and possessed the kind of patience that made glaciers look impulsive. The hunters had no idea they existed, because the Caleth were masters of staying hidden, and Marcus's research was classified. But Marcus knew exactly where they lived, how they behaved, and most importantly, what pissed them off. Dawn came with all the subtlety of a brick through a window, and the hunters began their sport with the enthusiasm of children opening presents. If those children were 8-foot-tall murder machines with subscription channels to maintain. They'd tracked Marcus's scent to his research station, found it abandoned, and began following his trail into the jungle with the confidence of predators who'd never encountered prey smart enough to think 3 moves ahead. Captain Talon took point, his enhanced senses following the human's path through the undergrowth, while his companions spread out in a hunting formation that had been perfected over centuries of successful kills. They were good at this, really good. They moved through the jungle like they owned it, communicating in subtle signals and adapting their tactics to the terrain with professional competence. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have been caught within an hour and turned into a very brief educational experience about the fragility of human anatomy. Unfortunately for them, these weren't normal circumstances, and Marcus wasn't normal prey. The first trap was subtle. A trip line connected to a counterweight that sent a dead log swinging through the hunting formation like nature's own baseball bat. It missed Captain Talon by inches and caught one of the Crythons square in the chest, sending him tumbling into a patch of thorn bushes that the locals called bleeding hearts because of how they made visitors feel. The Crythons' howls of pain and indignation echoed through the jungle, and Marcus, watching from his perch in the canopy, allowed himself a small smile. "Point 1 to the monkey," he whispered. Professor Scales examined the trap with the professional interest of someone who'd seen every hunting trick in the book. "Crude but effective," he rumbled. "The human shows intelligence. This will be entertaining." Oh, if only he knew. The second trap was more sophisticated. A pressure plate that triggered a spring-loaded mechanism Marcus had jury-rigged from camping equipment and sheer vindictiveness. When the lead Zephyrian stepped on it, he was suddenly wearing a face full of concentrated pepper plant extract, which was Kepler 438b's evolutionary answer to the question, what if pain could burn? Captain Talon's screams could probably be heard from orbit, and he spent the next 10 minutes stumbling around blind, clawing at his face and cursing in 17 different languages. His hunting party gathered around him, trying to flush out his eyes while scanning the jungle for more surprises. Marcus made a note in his field journal. Zephyrian pain tolerance, surprisingly low for supposed apex predator. The hunters regrouped, now considerably more cautious and significantly less confident. They'd expected to be hunting a frightened academic, not playing deadly games with someone who apparently had an engineering degree from the University of Spite. Captain Talon's eyes were still streaming, but his pride was hurt worse than his face. "The human possesses cunning," he announced, his voice tight with pain and embarrassment. "We adjust tactics accordingly." What they adjusted to was Marcus's third trap, which wasn't really a trap so much as applied biology. See, the shriek vines that covered most of the jungle floor weren't dangerous on their own. They just made noise when disturbed, like nature's own burglar alarm. But Marcus had spent weeks studying them and discovered something interesting. If you damaged them in just the right way, they released pheromones that attracted every carnivorous insect within a 2-kilometer radius. The hunting party walked right into Marcus's modified shriek vine patch. And within minutes, they were surrounded by clouds of insects that looked like flying staplers and had attitudes to match. The stinger swarms weren't deadly to large predators, but they were persistent, aggressive, and apparently considered alien visitors to be a delightful change from their usual diet of tree sap and despair. Marcus watched from above as 3 species of apex predators performed an impromptu dance routine that would have won awards if the judges valued artistic interpretation of, "What the hell, get them off me." The Krathen tried to bite the insects out of the air, which worked about as well as expected. The Zephyrians attempted to outfly them, forgetting that stinger swarms were designed by evolution to catch things that flew. The Vorthak Alpha just stood there taking the stings like a particularly stoic mountain until even his legendary patience cracked, and he began swatting at the air with movements that rattled the nearby trees. It took them 20 minutes to escape the swarm, and by then they were tired, irritated, and beginning to suspect that this hunt wasn't going to be the recreational murder spree they'd planned. "The human displays tactical thinking," Professor Scales observed, picking insects out of his scales with the resigned air of someone whose day wasn't going according to plan. "We may have underestimated our prey." "You think?" Marcus allowed them to regroup and treat their wounds while he prepared the next phase of his strategy. Phase 1 had been harassment and delay. Make them cautious, wear them down, and demonstrate that their quarry wasn't going to roll over and die conveniently. Phase 2 was about to be significantly more educational. The hunters spent an hour reorganizing their approach, treating their injuries, and probably questioning their life choices. They'd been tracking Marcus's trail for half the day and had nothing to show for it except pain, embarrassment, and a growing collection of welts. Their prey was staying ahead of them, setting traps, and generally behaving in ways that went against everything they understood about proper predator-prey relationships. Marcus, meanwhile, was leading them deeper into the jungle toward an area he'd marked on his maps as Calith territory. Do not disturb unless prepared for existential re-evaluation. The Calith weren't just apex predators. They were apex predators who'd gotten bored with the regular food chain and decided to freelance. The beauty of Marcus's plan was its simplicity. He didn't need to fight the hunters himself. He just needed to introduce them to something that would be happy to handle that job for him. It was like setting up a play date between house cats and tigers, if tigers held grudges and had been trained in guerrilla warfare. The hunters resumed tracking with increased caution and decreased enthusiasm. Every step now required checking for traps. Every shadow could hide an ambush, and the jungle around them seemed to have developed a malevolent personality that actively disliked their continued existence. Marcus led them along game trails he'd mapped during his research, staying just far enough ahead to avoid capture while leaving enough sign to keep them following. It was a delicate balance. Too obvious, and they'd suspect another trap. Too subtle, and they might lose the trail and go looking for easier prey. The 4th trap was purely psychological. Marcus had strung up several of his emergency flares in the canopy, rigged to motion sensors he'd improvised from his field equipment. As the hunting party passed underneath, the flares triggered in sequence, bathing the jungle in hellish red light, while speakers hidden in the undergrowth played recordings of Marcus's voice. "Welcome to Kepler 438b, gentlemen," his recorded voice announced with the cheerful enthusiasm of a tour guide describing a particularly scenic spot. "I hope you're enjoying your visit to our little ecosystem. Please watch your step. The local wildlife can be aggressive toward invasive species." The hunters spun in circles, weapons raised, looking for the source of the voice while the jungle around them pulsed red like the inside of an artery. The psychological effect was everything Marcus had hoped for. Suddenly they were no longer the hunters but the hunted, and every shadow could hide their tormentor. "Clever," Professor Scales admitted grudgingly. "The human seeks to unnerve us through theater." "It's working," one of the Krathen muttered, which earned him a glare from his pack leader. Marcus's voice continued from speakers positioned throughout the area. "You've probably noticed by now that your communications are being jammed. That's intentional. I'd hate for you to spoil the surprise for your friends back home. Don't worry, though. I'm sure they'll figure out what happened to you eventually. Probably when they find the pieces." The red flares died out, leaving the hunting party in sudden darkness while their eyes adjusted. In that moment of vulnerability, Marcus triggered his piece de resistance, a sound system that began broadcasting the territorial calls of every apex predator on Kepler 438b simultaneously. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The jungle suddenly sounded like it was hosting a convention for things that ate other things for fun, and the hunters found themselves back to back in a defensive circle, scanning for threats that could be anywhere or nowhere. Psychological warfare, Captain Talon hissed, his night vision slowly returning. The human attempts to break our morale. He wasn't wrong, but he was missing the point. The sound show wasn't just about morale, it was about location. Marcus was announcing to every predator in the area that there were strangers in their territory. Strangers who sounded like they were challenging every carnivore in the jungle to a fight, including the Caleth. Miles away, in the deepest part of the jungle where the canopy grew so thick that noon looked like twilight, something ancient and patient lifted its massive head and listened to the cacophony echoing through the trees. The Caleth had been dozing in the mud at the bottom of a cenote, dreaming whatever dreams apex predators dream, when the territorial calls began. To the Caleth, it sounded like every rival predator on the planet had decided to hold a convention in its backyard and forgot to send an invitation. This was the sort of insult that demanded a personal response. The creature began to move, 12 feet of evolutionary perfection sliding through water and mud with barely a ripple. It had been years since anything had been stupid enough to challenge it directly. This was going to be educational. Back at the hunting party, the sounds finally faded, leaving the jungle in ominous silence. The hunters regrouped and began moving forward again, but their earlier confidence was gone. They were no longer pursuing easy prey. They were walking through hostile territory where every tree could hide an enemy, and every step could be their last. Marcus watched them advance toward the Caleth's territory and allowed himself to feel a moment of professional satisfaction. 6 months of research were about to pay off in the most spectacular way possible, and he had a front-row seat for what promised to be the galaxy's most educational nature documentary. The hunters reached the edge of Caleth territory just as afternoon rain began to fall, turning the jungle floor into a maze of mud and standing water. They moved more slowly now, partly from caution and partly because Professor Scales was beginning to suspect that their prey might be leading them somewhere specific. The human's trail has been too convenient, he observed, studying the muddy ground. We follow paths, not wilderness. This suggests planning beyond simple flight. You think it's another trap? Captain Talon asked, wiping rain from his face while his injured eyes continued to stream. I think we are no longer hunting. Professor Scales replied grimly. I think we are being herded. He was absolutely right, but by then it was too late to matter. The Caleth had been tracking them for the last hour, moving parallel to their path through water channels that connected the cenotes and underground rivers. It was learning their scent, studying their movement patterns, and planning their deaths with the methodical patience of something that had never needed to hurry. Marcus, still following from the canopy, caught his first glimpse of the Caleth as it surfaced briefly in a pool of dark water. Even knowing it was there, the creature was almost invisible. Its scaled hide perfectly matched the muddy water, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that was part of the environment itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus whispered to himself, let me introduce you to the real apex predator. The attack, when it came, was everything Marcus had hoped for, and more. The hunting party was crossing a clearing filled with knee-deep water and fallen logs when the Caleth struck. It came from below, surging out of the water like a living missile, jaws wide enough to swallow a speeder bike. Its target was one of the Krathen who'd been bringing up the rear. The creature disappeared in an explosion of water and screams that cut off abruptly as 12 feet of apex predator dragged it beneath the surface. The remaining hunters scattered, weapons raised, scanning the churning water for their attacker. But the Caleth had already vanished, leaving only ripples and a spreading cloud of blood to mark its passage. What was that? Captain Talon shrieked, his earlier composure completely gone. Professor Scales was consulting his tactical display, trying to get readings on their attacker. Unknown species, large, predatory. Aquatic adaptation suggests ambush hunting strategy. It took Kresh. Another Crathen whimpered, staring at the spot where his packmate had vanished. Just took him and gone. Marcus made another note in his field journal. Calith hunting strategy. Flawless execution, excellent timing, very educational for observers not currently being eaten. The hunters tried to leave the water, but the Calith had chosen its battlefield well. The clearing was surrounded by deeper pools and waterways, and every path to higher ground required crossing exposed areas where the creature could strike again. They made it halfway to solid ground before the second attack. This time the Calith took one of the Zephyrians, erupting from beneath a fallen log where it had been waiting with the patience of stone. The bird-like hunter had just enough time to scream before vanishing beneath the surface in another explosion of violence and spray. "We're being systematically eliminated," Professor Scales realized, his tactical mind finally grasping the scope of their situation. "This creature is not attacking randomly. It's hunting us." The remaining hunters, Captain Talon, Professor Scales, and 3 Crathen, tried to form a defensive perimeter in the center of the clearing, weapons trained on the water around them. But they were playing by the Calith's rules now, standing in its element while it circled them like a shark that had learned to appreciate foreplay. "The human," Captain Talon said suddenly, his voice tight with realization. "The human led us here. It knew about this creature." Marcus, who had found a comfortable perch in a tree overlooking the clearing, decided this was an excellent time to rejoin the conversation. He activated his speakers again, his voice echoing across the water with the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather. "Oh, good, you figured it out," Marcus announced. "I was starting to wonder if you were actually as intelligent as your species claims. Yes, I led you here. Yes, I knew about our friend in the water, and yes, this was entirely intentional." The hunters spun toward his voice, weapons raised, but Marcus was well hidden and spoke from multiple speakers scattered around the area. He could be anywhere or everywhere. "You see," Marcus continued, his tone growing more conversational, "you made a fundamental error when you decided to hunt on my planet. This is my research site. I know every species, every behavior pattern, every ecological relationship in this jungle. You're just tourists with delusions of adequacy." Another Crathen vanished with a splash and a brief scream, dragged under by claws that could shred steel. The remaining hunters clustered closer together, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. "The creature you're currently feeding is called a Calith," Marcus explained helpfully. "Apex predator, perfect ambush hunter, and generally unimpressed by visitors who think they're higher on the food chain. I've been studying them for 6 months, and I can tell you with scientific certainty that you have absolutely no chance of survival." Professor Scales fired into the water where he thought he'd seen movement, but the energy bolts just boiled away harmlessly. "The human seeks to demoralize us with information. Pay no attention to its words." "Actually, I'm trying to educate you," Marcus corrected. "See, you made the classic mistake of thinking that being dangerous made you smart. But intelligence beats aggression every time, especially when intelligence has home field advantage and 6 months of research data." The Calith took another Crathen, this time with such speed that the others barely saw the splash before their companion was gone. 2 left now, Captain Talon and Professor Scales, standing back to back in increasingly shallow water as their predators circled them with lazy confidence. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, his voice now coming from directly above them. "That Calith is going to kill you both in the next few minutes. It's got nowhere to be and all day to do it, while you're standing in its living room making noise and bleeding into its water. This is going to end exactly one way." Captain Talon looked up, trying to spot Marcus in the canopy. "You could have warned us," he called out. "You could have prevented this." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its conversational tone. "You came here to hunt for sport, to kill things for entertainment and broadcast it to your subscribers. You wanted to turn my research site into your personal slaughterhouse. So no, I couldn't have prevented this, but I could ensure it ended appropriately." The final attack was almost anticlimactic. The Caleth rose from the water like a living nightmare, jaws agape, and Professor Scales managed exactly one shot before the creature's jaws closed around him. Captain Talon tried to take flight, but the jungle canopy was too dense and the Caleth too fast. The last of the hunters vanished beneath the surface with a splash that seemed ridiculously small for such a definitive ending. Marcus waited in silence for several minutes, watching the water gradually settle. The Caleth surfaced once, briefly, studying him with ancient eyes before disappearing back into the depths. It had fed well and had no interest in prey that showed the wisdom to stay out of its territory. "Well," Marcus said to the empty clearing, "that was educational." The aftermath was almost mundane compared to the carnage. Marcus climbed down from his tree, collected his equipment, and began the hike back to his research station. He had reports to file, data to analyze, and probably some very awkward conversations with his supervisors about why a hunting expedition had mysteriously vanished near his research site. He found the hunter's ship exactly where they'd left it, and after a brief internal debate, he decided that salvage rights probably applied to vessels whose owners had been eaten by local wildlife. The ship's communication array was significantly better than his research station's equipment, and Marcus used it to send a message to the orbital authorities. "This is Dr. Marcus Chen at Research Station 7, he transmitted. "I'm reporting a hunting expedition that appears to have encountered difficulties with local wildlife. No survivors. The ecosystem here is more dangerous than previously cataloged. I recommend upgrading the hazard classification and restricting access to qualified research personnel only." The response came back within an hour. "Understood, Dr. Chen. We'll dispatch a recovery team to investigate. Please document any evidence of what occurred for our report." Marcus looked out at the jungle where the Caleth had returned to its patient vigil at the bottom of the cenote. "Documented," he replied. "Local apex predators successfully defended territory against invasive species. Ecosystem balance maintained. Recommend continued monitoring and protection of indigenous wildlife." He filed his report under Successful Species Interaction Study and went back to documenting the mating habits of creatures that glittered. The jungle returned to its normal rhythms. The Caleth settled back into its comfortable routine of sleeping and occasionally eating things that disturbed its peace, and Marcus continued his research with the satisfaction of a job well done. 3 weeks later, he received a priority message from the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Society, offering him a promotion, a substantial raise, and assignment to the most dangerous wildlife preserve in known space. Apparently, his field report had been forwarded to some very interested parties who appreciated his innovative approach to ecosystem protection and creative problem-solving abilities. Marcus accepted the promotion with enthusiasm. After all, the galaxy was full of places where dangerous wildlife needed protection from tourists with delusions of adequacy, and he'd apparently found his calling in life. The moral of the story, if there is one, is simple. Never underestimate the species that climbed down from the trees, looked at a hostile universe, and decided that the appropriate response was to make tools, study everything, and turn superior firepower into an academic exercise. Because sometimes the most dangerous predator in the jungle is the one with a clipboard, a research grant, and absolutely no sense of proportional response to people who threaten his work. Marcus Chen went on to have a long and successful career in wildlife conservation, though he never again encountered hunters quite as educational as his first group. The Caleth of Kepler 438b lived happily ever after, secure in their territory and occasionally receiving care packages of hunting parties from Dr. Chen's later assignments. And if you're ever tempted to go sport hunting on a research planet, remember this story and maybe consider taking up a safer hobby instead, like juggling active grenades or wrestling black holes, because the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes that sense of humor has a PhD in xenobiology and access to apex predators. The end.